Good morning, hello, we're going to start. Good morning. This is the first meeting of the 2010-2011 academic year of the Arnold Pfeffer Center for Neuropsychoanalysis, and this is our 20th year that we're now starting with this meeting. 20th year of holding monthly meetings in this auditorium, inviting neuroscientists, eminent neuroscientists, working on topics which were either once the preserve of psychoanalysis or otherwise at least are of interest and importance to psychoanalysts. Today's meeting is a special one. It's the highlight of our academic year. It's the occasion of the Arnold Pfeffer Prize lecture. This is the 8th time that the Arnold Pfeffer Prize is being awarded. Its previous recipients have been Antonio Damasio, Helen Mayberg, Nora Volkow, Jaak Panksepp, Eric Kandel, who am I leaving out? Chevron, Howard Chevron, and me, myself. That's right. Nepotistic award. That's it. So this is the... Oh, and Stephen Swomey. So that's right. So it's not the 8th, it's the 9th time that we're giving the prize. Thank you very much, Maggie. Traditionally, the prize was given to the author of a paper published in the previous year that was thought to do the most to bridge the divide between psychoanalysis and the neurosciences. And as you can see, I had difficulty remembering names, so I'm certainly not going to remember all the papers concerned. But the important point is that this year we've changed that rule, and we're going to change it from here on. We're no longer going to give the prize for an individual paper, but rather for a body of work. A body of work, that is, which in the opinion of the illustrious Arnold Pfeffer Prize Committee has done the most to bridge that divide that I referred to earlier between psychoanalysis and the neurosciences. So what better opportunity than in the year that we changed that rule than to rectify a problem that we were faced with because of the previous rule. I think that without a shadow of doubt, the single most important paper, although that was not the intention of the authors, the single most important paper that has proven to be a font of research and scholarly work that bridges the divide that I keep referring to was that famous paper by Professors Gallese and Rizzolatti and others in their lab in Parma, which announced to the world the discovery of mirror neurons. It was recently said by Rama, I think, that it's the most important discovery since DNA, and that gives you some sense of the momentousness of the discovery that they published in 1992, which didn't enable us to give them the prize for that paper. I discovered to my amusement, I didn't know this, and I'll tell it to my fellow failures in the world, that their paper was rejected by Nature. Can you believe it? That paper was rejected by Nature. So you see, there's hope for us all. And Professor Gallese and many more papers after that were rejected. The reason for the rejection was the famous one that's given by Nature, which is that the paper was not of sufficient general interest. So, as I said, since that famous decision, everyone else seems to have decided that it's probably of the most general interest ever since the discovery of the double helix. It has had an enormous impact on the neurosciences in general, what's come to be known as social neuroscience in particular, but also within our own particular area of interest, that is to say, the interface between psychoanalysis and neuroscience. I hardly need to explain why, and Professor Gallese's presentation now will more than make up for my reluctance to try to summarize why it's of such consequence for psychoanalysis. But just to say the obvious, the fact that mirror neurons have been generally recognized to be a foundation stone of what we consider, what we call empathy in our neck of the woods. Empathy and everything that goes with that, the ability to intuit, to know the state of mind and the intentionality of the other. And it turns out to be a particularly important part of what the mirror neuron system is all about. It's not just about a matter of echoing, but rather of the mental aspects of action, as I'm sure Professor Gallese's presentation will make clear. But then also all sorts of complex things that are related to that through theory of mind, a sort of a bottom-up version of theory of mind, and indeed communication in general, language and communication in general, and of particular interest to us, also these complex processes that go under the heading of internalization. It is an extremely rich font of ideas and of potential bridges between what was traditionally the preserve of psychoanalysis and what has increasingly become an extremely exciting area within the neurosciences. I'm not going to say very much more, except a few housekeeping things. One is that in the notice that was sent out, I see that I am the discussant of this paper. That's a mistake. This is an award lecture. There's no discussant, but Professor Gallese has very kindly agreed to take your questions after his presentation, so I will run around with the mic. And then the other thing, which is not quite housekeeping, but rather to call Professor Gallese up so that I can give him the Arnold Pfeffer Prize. It's being awarded to him and to Professor Rizzolatti jointly. Here's the medal, and this is when you clap. The other medal, and it comes also with a check, which is always good. Professor Gallese is, I'm not going to tell you his CV. He's super famous, super important, super brilliant, super successful. He's a professor of human physiology in the Department of Neuroscience at the University of Parma with Professor Rizzolatti, who I think is the director of the department. If I may say so, Professor Gallese's work has been more interesting to psychoanalysts than Professor Rizzolatti, so I'm very pleased that he's the one who took the trip over here, because he seems more engaged with the sorts of things, as you'll see, that particularly interest us. He's published a zillion papers, won a zillion prizes, visiting professorships, doctorates honoris causa, etc., etc. Professor Vittorio Gallese. Thank you.
Good morning, everybody. It's an honor and a privilege being here among you today, and I wish to express my thanks and the thanks on behalf of Giacomo Rizzolatti, who couldn't make it, for this most prestigious award. I think we are living a very exciting time. There is a very good chance to establish a new dialogue between different disciplines, which nevertheless share the very same topic, although viewed from different angles, from different perspectives, using different languages. So we should be very careful not to spoil this magic moment. And as a neuroscientist, I always bear in mind that we should stay clear of neurohubris, which means taking for granted everything we read out of our high-tech machine. But I'll come back to that. A disclaimer. I will be dealing with important aspects of human relationship, social relationship, from a reductionist point of view, a methodological reductionist point of view. So I will be dealing with action, sensations, emotions. This shouldn't generate the idea that I consider the domain of action, emotion, and sensation as being encapsulated, or even worse, as being the functional outcome of specialized and modularized organization of our brain. This is only the consequence of our very simple and, as I said, methodologically speaking, reductionist approach to how the brain works, which also means that in a slow but steady, incremental way, we are going to bring the pieces of this puzzle more and more together. I would like to start with Freud. Here's a quote from 1925. "What is mental is in itself unconscious, and being conscious is only a quality which may or may not accrue to a particular mental act." And these words resonate incredibly vividly today, when also neuroscience finally discovered that there is a prevalent non-conscious dimension in human cognition. So we can claim definitely that Freud is not dead. And let me briefly go through some quotes where the notion of Einfühlung is incredibly important. Here is a quote from Group Psychology and the Analysis of the Ego. "The process which psychology calls empathy and which plays the largest part in our understanding of what is inherently foreign to our ego in other people." And 2 pages later, a path, this is very important, a path leads from identification by way of imitation to empathy. That is, to the comprehension of the mechanism by which we are enabled to take up any attitude at all towards another mental life. So Freud makes explicit in his writings that a basic dimension of interpersonal relations occurs at the pre-verbal and implicit level. And finally, it is only by empathy that we know the existence of psychic life other than our own. If we move quickly back to the present, we should face the fact that the still predominant view on how the mind works in cognitive neuroscience is certainly not that of empathy. According to the mainstream view, action and intention understanding consist of interpreting and explaining in mental terms intentionally opaque behaviors, viewed as mere biological motion. So I'm facing a kind of very dexterous and skilled zombie. It doesn't move like a Romero zombie. It's very fluid. Nevertheless, all I have to witness is movement. And in order to make a story, a coherent story of that movement, I must, following a kind of ascending routine, interpret that movement as the outcome of some inner mental state I can gain access to uniquely by means of inferential logic and theory-like enterprises. So this explanatory process is referred to as mind reading. That is, the attribution to others of internal mental states mapped in the mind of the observer as internal representation that for many are supposed to be in propositional format. So the overlap between natural language and the language of thought is very blurred. Here's a quote from a good friend of mine, Alvin Goldman, who's in Rutgers now, from his book Simulating Minds in 2006, where he presents the most complete version of his simulation theory of mind reading. In other words, to mind read is to form a judgment, belief, or representation. I progressively but constantly moved away from this notion of mentalization. So very briefly, sketchily, my point is the following. Our seemingly effortless capacity to perceive the bodies inhabiting our social world as goal-oriented individuals like us depends on the existence of a shared we-centric space. And I have proposed, since 10 years almost, that this shared manifold space can be characterized at the functional level as embodied simulation. So what is embodied simulation, and why do I need to add the qualification embodied to the notion of simulation? I take it to be a crucial functional mechanism in social cognition. We started digging out this dimension of intersubjectivity by discovering mirror neurons in the macaque monkey brain, but quite soon it appeared that action mirroring, motor resonance, was only one part of the story, because the same mechanism, as we will see briefly this morning, also applied to the domain of emotion and sensation. So it's not exclusively confined to the domain of action, but it encompasses other aspects of intersubjectivity, as I said, such as emotions and sensation. Why is it embodied? It is embodied because it uses a pre-existing body model in the brain, and therefore it involves a pre-rational and non-predicative form of representation. So, to put it explicitly, it turns out that we have an isomorphic representational format in our brain-body system. And because of that, we map the actions of others onto our own motor representation, as well as others' emotion and sensations onto our own visceromotor and sensory motor representations. So, what these findings are inviting us to do is to abandon the Cartesian view of the primacy of the ego, although even in my research activity, I'm always trapped in a tension between giving the primacy to an egological perspective and, on the other hand, emphasizing the co-constructive nature of the idol relationship. Probably it's really hard to find a clear-cut line dividing these two aspects of our mind. I'm quite sure, nevertheless, that we should adopt a perspective which emphasizes the fact that the other is co-originally given as the self. Because self and other appear to be intertwined because of the intercorporeity linking them. And this is a term which I explicitly borrow from Merleau-Ponty. There are many levels at which we may wish to emphasize the intercorporeal similarity between human beings. The easiest one stay on the surface, which is not what I mean by pointing the crucial importance of intercorporeity as a capital dimension in explaining what's going on each time we meet another human being. Intercorporeity describes a crucial aspect of intersubjectivity, not just because intersubjectivity is to be grounded on a mere exterior similarity between our body and the body of others, but rather because we all share the same intentional objects and our situated motor systems are similarly wired to accomplish similar goals. So I'm a motor chauvinist, and therefore I would like to quote Goethe from the Faust: "In the beginning was action." So the basic experience we entertain of ourselves as bodily self is from the very beginning driven by our interactions with other bodies. And this is really literally true. So, following Buber, in the beginning is relation. We recently completed a study which I'm glad to have the opportunity to present to you. It will be published online on the 7th of October in PLOS ONE. And what we did in this study was to measure the kinematics of the movements performed by twins in the womb between the 14 and the 18 week of gestation. So it's ultrasonographic recording of their interaction, which was later on subjected to a kinematic analysis. So we can study the movement of these twins, fetus twins, as much as we can study intentional behavior in children or in adults. And we know a great deal about how we move intentionally our upper limb. We know that biological motion is characterized by a bell-shaped curve of velocity the more accurate the movement, the more time we spend in decelerating, and so much so forth. So the striking nature of this result is that the very same rules seem to apply also to fatal movements. And just to give you the gist of what I'm talking about. So here is twin A, who is the toucher. Here is twin B, who is being touched. Gently pat by the left arm of twins A on his shoulder. And as soon as he appreciates the touching, his body starts to move as a sort of reaction. Yeah, it's much clearer on my desktop. So, the first interesting result of this study is that twin fetuses display upper limb movements with different kinematic profiles according to their self-directed or social nature already at the 14th gestational week, which means we could distinguish three typologies of movement: movement targeting the self, movement targeting the walls of the womb, and movements targeting the twin brothers. And if you compare movement duration measured in milliseconds and deceleration time, you see that the slowest and most decelerated movements are those which have this social nature, when the twin brother is interacting with the other member of the couple. And these results were consistent in 5 couples of twins we studied. This work was done mainly by my colleague Umberto Castiello, who is the psychology department of the University of Padua. A further interesting result is that between the 14 and the 18 weeks, the proportion of self-directed movements decreases, whereas that of social movements aimed at the sibling increases. So the global quantity of movement as the two fetuses grow diminish. However, while at the 14-week self-directed movement tend to prevail, at the 18-week the relative proportion is inverted. So they tend most frequently to perform social movement than autistic movement, if you pass me the expression. So it seems that the human motor system well before birth is equipped with functional properties enabling social interactions. So this perhaps might suggest that the dawning of what Neisser in 1988 defined the interpersonal self occurs before birth, when the context enables it, as we have seen in the case of twin fetuses. Social interactions are not only possible, but predominate over self-directed actions. Okay, and now here comes the big question mark. What has the brain to do with all these things? In 1991, it was a very hot July in Parma. We were studying neurons that respond both when the monkey is actively engaged in goal-related motor acts like grasping a raisin or a peanut, but interestingly enough, also when the monkey is merely looking at the object, no matter if the monkey has the purpose to grasp it later on. These that we refer to as canonical neurons are neurons that transform the three-dimensional shape of an object into the most suitable motor program that might be relevant to do things with the very same object. So we were grasping objects and presenting them to the monkey. And finally, we realized that some of these neurons had a quite odd timing of their response. So the response did not occur when we expected it to be, which means at the moment where the object was made visible to the monkey, but earlier on. And after a while, we realized that some of these neurons were responding when we were actually grasping the object in order to later on show it to the monkey. So it took us months to rule out alternative explanation. Well, it can't be possible. Maybe the monkey is moving. So what we are measuring is not really a visual response, but aborted movements that pass unnoticed. So we spend a lot of time in recording the EMG of the mouth, of the hand of the monkey just to make sure we were measuring visual responses. And finally, it turned out that these were genuine visual responses. So the monkey was doing nothing but looking at the experimenter performing the very same motor act that when actively executed on the monkey's side drove the neural discharge. Well, the very same neuron would respond with the same specificity also to a similar correlated motor act being performed in front of the monkey by another individual, be it a human being like in this cartoon or by a monkey. Along the years, we studied the functional properties of this neuron, and we discovered many interesting things. We discovered that this neuron that we described in the ventral premotor cortex, Brodmann area 6, but later on we discovered them also in the posterior parietal cortex, and we were able to show that these two different cortical foci are reciprocally connected so they form a brain circuit. We also discovered that the monkey wasn't required to observe the full development of the action. Suppose I hide an object behind the screen of my laptop. You know the object is here. Then you see my hand disappearing behind it. You know, you intuit that I'm about to grasp the object which is hidden behind. Well, 50% of the mirror neuron we tested with this paradigm also consistently fired when the grasping could only be imagined because it wasn't made explicitly visible to the monkey. Even the noise produced by a motor act like cracking a peanut or tearing a sheet of paper apart is enough to drive their discharge. So from the very beginning, we proposed that this mechanism embodies an abstract action motor representation, which is abstract but nevertheless clearly non- or pre-linguistic. So the idea is that what we have here is a non-meta-representational form of action understanding by evoking in the observer the very same motor program that he would activate if instead of witnessing the behavior of someone else, he was the actual agent of that behavior. You have the possibility to grasp the meaning of what you are looking at, so to speak, from within. Mirror neurons in humans. For many years, people were quite skeptical because, I mean, empirical work, empirical evidence accumulated suggesting that a similar mechanism was most likely present in the human brain, first by using transcranial magnetic stimulation, high-density EEG, magnetoencephalography, and functional brain imaging. But still many people resisted and claimed that what we took to be evidence of a mirroring mechanism might be caused by the poor spatial resolution of brain imaging techniques. So to make it more explicit, people would maintain that if a given cortical region in our brain is active both when I act but also when I see someone else acting, it could depend not on the fact that that brain area contains mirror neurons, but simply because in that area coexist two different populations of neurons, one of which is active when I act, the other when I see someone else acting. And just because of the poor spatial resolution of our technique, we cannot tell them apart. Luckily enough, this year, Marco Iacoboni and Itzhak Fried, who is a neurosurgeon working at UCLA, provided single neuron evidence from the human brain of the existence of mirror neurons. So now the discussion is not about the existence of mirror neurons, but their heuristic value. There's a nice joke by Ramachandran about new discoveries and how they steer reactions among colleagues. So the first reaction is, it cannot possibly be true. Next comes the reaction, well, it's true, but doesn't explain anything. And finally, well, it explained that, but we always knew it. So we are between the second and third step as I speak. Okay, so what are the earliest evidence of motor resonance in the human brain? This paper, which appeared in 2006 using near-infrared spectroscopy, shows motor resonance in 6 months old. More recently, Gergo Shibra and colleagues in London, using high-density EEG, was able to show mirroring, which is measured as a suppression of the alpha rhythm. Gaston already in 1959, by a simple EEG, described mirror neurons, although he was not aware of what he was describing. He was describing a suppression of the alpha rhythm, both when you execute an action, but also when you see someone else doing it. So the discovery was already there, but he didn't realize the potentiality of this finding, which passed unnoticed. Now we know where to look, and so this study shows that both when the 9-month-old grasps something, or when he's or she is looking at someone doing the same, there is alpha suppression over the central electrodes recording activity around the precentral motor strip, which means that the motor system is activated both when you act and also when you see someone else acting. And this cartoon shows a very recent meta-analysis of the brain region that turned out to be activated through the employment of fMRI, mainly brain imaging, both during the observation and the execution of a variety of movement, upper limb movement, intransitive movement, reaching movement, transitive distal movement, grasping, manipulating, holding, and tool use. So basically is the ventral premotor cortex, which encompasses the posterior part of Broca's region, the posterior parietal cortex, and a region within the superior temporal sulcus. So mirroring mechanisms in humans are diversified. These cortical sites, which I just showed you, turn out to be activated both during the execution, the imitation, and the observation of body movements, object-directed action, communicative action, and what is important for the talking cure, also while listening to or reading words or sentences describing actions. Other cortical sites are similarly activated during the experience or the observation of emotion and sensations. And I want to tell you something very briefly on that. First experiment, you see someone like this chap, inhaling from what is contained in this glass and then displaying this facial expression, and we all recognize it's not fear, it's not surprise, it's not anger, it's not sadness, it's not joy, it's disgust. So the point is, how do we do it? We built an experiment in which we were interested in confronting which part of the brain of healthy volunteers activate when they are witnessing the expression of disgust, with another condition where they subjectively experience the very same emotion. So in order to do that, we convinced them to wear a mask while lying in the scanner, and through this mask we were delivering synchronously with their inspiration disgusting odorants, because we wanted to generate the genuine feeling of disgust. And the experiment was done in France, so the color code is non-coincidental. We did it in Marseille, because we didn't have an fMRI machine back then, so we had to wander convincing people to do fMRI experiment on things we were interested to study. So this tiny little portion of a very deep region in the frontal lobe, which is called the insula, or the insula of Ryle, turns out to be active both when I feel disgust, but also when I witness the facial expression of disgust of someone else. Then I would like to anticipate a question. If everything is shared, how can we tell our disgust from the disgust of someone else apart. Clearly, when you watch this video, this short video, everybody in this room was able to tell this guy is expressing disgust without experiencing ourselves disgust. So how comes that it is possible to empathize, but without losing the boundaries of my understanding of his or her own experience of disgust? Well, it turns out that this spot in the anterior insula is only one part of a much more complex story, which means that this part of our brain is shared both when we experience disgust and when we witness the disgust of someone else. However, as demonstrated by other experiments, when I witness the disgust of someone else, or when I read a narrative about the disgust experienced by a fictitious character, there are other brain regions which are activated, which are not activated when I subjectively experience disgust. So the idea is that this core of brain activation, which is shared between I and thou, is enabling me to empathize with your disgust without simultaneously experiencing disgust myself. So, which shows that beyond the level which is certainly available to human beings, which is an inference by analogy, there is a much more direct way to come to grasp with what the other individuals are experiencing, what I designate as embodied simulation, which is the functional name to designate a variety of mirroring mechanisms that we were able to describe in the human brain. And the same applies to sensations. Back in 1999, with Alvin Goldman, we were speculating that mirror neurons could be just the tip of a much bigger iceberg still to be uncovered, to be described. And we postulated that our brain could house other kinds of mirror neurons also dealing with tactile sensations, for example. And in 2004, with Christian Cases, we were able to test this hypothesis, and we were able to demonstrate that one brain region which is normally activated when our body is touched is also activated when we witness the body of someone else being touched, but not when we see the same body part of someone else being only approached by the same object. So when we feel touch, S2 is bilaterally activated. When we see the body of someone else being touched, S2 is also activated. 1 year later, here is the spot which shows this overlap between the experience of touch and the vision of touch. 1 year later, Sarah Jane Blackmore, Chris Friet, and colleagues at UCL moved one step further because they were able to show that a synesthetic patient, namely a patient, well, he's not a patient, actually she was a member of their group, and when she was shown the video they were supposedly being using with their healthy volunteers, she said, of course, we empathize, I can feel it on my body. So Sarah said, wait a minute, what do you say? You feel it on your body? Is that a metaphor? And she said, no, I literally feel the caress or the slap on my face when I see someone else experiencing the very same tactile experience. And it turned out that she showed the activation of this mirroring mechanism with a higher intensity with respect to the healthy controls who were only able to empathize without actually feeling it on their own body. And more recently, we continued this study, and we were able to show that S2 is activated by any kind of touch, even if non-intentional. For example, when you see the branch of a tree moved by a fan touching a chair or a piece of furniture. So the idea is that even if we are aware that this is non-intentional, that it's something occurring between two non-sentient part of the physical world, like a branch of a tree and a piece of furniture, nevertheless, non-coincidentally, we use the very same tactile vocabulary. And the idea that was already suggested by Vico in the 18th century is that we systematically use our body as a filter to make sense of the world. So the I is a bodily I, as Freud have very clearly intuited. So this year we published this paper where, as I said, still being employing a reductionist approach, we try to add more dimension to our stimuli. So in this study, we not only show it to our volunteers tactile experiences of someone else, but we also introduced the affective quality of those tactile experiences. So healthy volunteers, while lying in the scanner, were shown video clips where they saw a palm tree moved by a fan touching the forearm of another individual, or a human hand caressing the other human hand, hitting it, or very neutrally touching it. And as you see here, at the briefing, they were shown again the videos, and we asked our participant to rate the videos in terms of pleasantness, affective valence, and intensity. And it is clear they were able to differentiate all these qualities among the stimuli that were shown. And finally, in a block of trials, we touched their hands in order to localize the brain areas that normally are active when our body is being touched. And here we made, I think, a quite interesting discovery. The first discovery is that the posterior part of the second somatosensory area is sensitive to affective quality of the observed touch. Second, a region in the ventral premotor cortex is also modulated by the affective quality of the tactile experience we see being experienced by someone else. But the most interesting result of this study, in my opinion, is the last one. Namely, there is another brain region which is activated when my body is touched, particularly when I'm experiencing a tactile sensation rich in affective quality, being caressed or slapped. And this brain region is the posterior insula. Interestingly enough, when I'm witnessing the affective quality of the tactile experiences of someone else, instead of activating, my own posterior insula deactivates. So the signal goes down. And we carried out a PPI analysis, so we were interested to measure what other brain region might be responsible of this modulation of the activation of the posterior insula when you are witnessing the tactile experience of someone else. And it turned out that these brain regions are the right temporoparietal junction, that Pace for Rebecca Sachs is not uniquely activated by mind-reading task. It's activated by a variety of non-mind-reading related tasks, among which, and most importantly, when you have to monitor the border of your bodily self. The right hemisphere, posterior parietal cortex, and the left hemisphere, ventral premotor cortex. So this network of areas which are highly relevant to establish the boundary of our bodily self. Indeed, they are involved in the rubber hand illusion and a variety of tasks in which, by means of playing tricks, you may induce a displacement of your own body ownership, for example, by simultaneously stroking your hand, unseen hand, and a rubber hand, which occupies the position where you would expect to see your own hand. Anyway, this brain network is exerting a modulatory effect on the posterior insula, so that the posterior insula, which is normally activated when I am caressed or I am slapped, is deactivated when I witness those tactile sensations being experienced by someone else. So again, the sharing is never complete. So we empathize, and empathizing has nothing to do with emotional contagion. So the present results suggest that the bold response in posterior insular cortex is specifically modulated by the observation of social or intentional touch, independent of whether it has a positive or a negative affective valence, but not by the observation of inanimate touch. This activation pattern in posterior insular cortex, however, is opposite for the experience, signal goes up, and the observation of affective touch when signal goes down. The activation in posterior insular cortex could reflect a suppression of self-oriented arousal rather than being part of a shared neural circuit for self and other. And this leads to interesting speculation on development. Because if we look at the developmental perspective, capitalizing upon the data I just showed you, self-oriented emotional arousal observed in infants when they witness other emotional experiences and involving a direct affective sharing, which gradually evolves in other-oriented empathic behavior with increasing cognition, self-awareness, and self-regulation, could perhaps epitomize the development of neural circuits which are able to suppress this activation of posterior insula when you are not experiencing this sensation but simply witnessing the sensation of someone else. And in the very last part of my talk, I would like to test some of the things I've been telling you so far in the field of psychopathology. And for sake of concision, I won't mention what we did in autism, but only focus on very recent results. We are collecting in a population of first episode psychotic patients. I would like to quote, yes, you. This is really a marvelous book, which I read this summer. And this is something we should always bear in mind. Medical history changes, and many, if not most, doctors have little grasp of what came before their own contemporary frames for diagnosis. So we'd like to I could also quote Giuseppe Verdi, who, when composing one of his masterwork, Un ballo in maschera, he was writing, and I don't take this statement to be always valid, it can be very dangerous if spelled out in the political domain as such, but guardiamo al passato e ne seguirà un progresso, which means let's look to the past and a progress will ensue. It's not always valid, especially in politics, especially in Europe. But in this case, I think it's worthwhile looking back. And so I don't want to tell you what is schizophrenia. You know much better than I do. But it's quite interesting to point out that, for example, for Bleuler, autism was a key feature of schizophrenia. Autism has the incapacity to be attuned with the world, according to Bleuler, constitutes the basic clinical essence of schizophrenia. And this dimension becomes even more explicit in the writings of Eugene Minkowski, and his book on schizophrenia is one of the best books I've ever had the chance to read. I don't know if it is translated in English, but it should if it doesn't. According to Minkowski, the core problem of schizophrenic is their lack of vital contact with reality, viewed as an incapacity to resonate with the world, to establish meaningful bonds with other individuals. And more recently, Blankenburg speak of the autistic dimension of schizophrenia as a global crisis of common sense. the incapacity to pre-reflexively grasp the meaning of the world, the loss of the natural evidence of the world, as he mentions it. And even more recently, Parnas and Beauvais, here is a quote from a paper they published together with the phenomenologist Dan Zahavi in 2002, experience in schizophrenia is more observed than lived, most likely because of the incapacity to attain a non-reflective, tacit sensibility, procuring a background texture or organization to the field of experience. Here's from a paper by Thomas Fuchs, who is a psychiatrist with whom I collaborate since 4 years in Heidelberg. Is a report from a 28-year-old female patient. For some time I had a feeling as if my clothes did not seem appropriate anymore. My gait had changed. I walked stiffly and did not know how to hold my hands. Then I often looked into the mirror and found that my facial expression had changed, and I began to think that I might be regarded as a prostitute. Men looked so strange at me. I took passport pictures of myself in order to examine whether I only imagined that. Then I began to feel a kind of charging or tension in my body when others came near to me, as if it were passing over from them. Finally, I thought I should be made a prostitute by brain manipulation. So, we were interested to study this preverbal dimension of the bodily self that we take to be tightly linked with this premotor schema that has been characterized too much dichotomously as standing clear from the self-aware body image we entertain of our own body. The border between body schema and body image is much less clear than people take it to be. So we studied 24 patients. First episode, a schizophrenic patient, on average 7 months after the first episode. They were all on atypical antipsychotic drugs, quetiapine, risperidone, and the like. They were all right-handed, and this is the score on the PANSS positive and negative scale. But what is interesting is that in Chieti University, the head of the clinic of psychiatry is a psychopathologist and also a trained psychoanalyst. These kind of psychiatrists are gone forever in our country. Most psychiatrists don't even know anything about phenomenological psychopathology. They only know DSM-4. And I don't take it to be a progress in psychiatry for the years to come. But luckily enough, here the clinic is chaired by this incredibly stimulating colleague who is one of the few employing to studying psychotic patient the basic symptom scale, which is a scale which capitalizes upon the first-person experience of psychotic patients, originally developed by Huber in Bonn and then modified by Kloster-Kötter, who in Germany is the leading psychiatrist in studying the early phases of psychosis, just to identify the early symptoms that can make the diagnosis the earliest. So we systematically subjected all these patients to the SPI-A, which is a simplified version of this scale. And this is the reference to SPI-A. So basically, basic symptoms are present during the entire disease progression and are reported not only for the post-psychotic stages, but also retrospectively for the early course. So they have a very predictive value. They are described as subjectively experienced cognitive, perceptual, affective, dynamic, and social disturbances often recognized by the affected person years before the appearance of full-blown psychosis and present during all the phases of the illness. So basic symptoms, being self-experiences, differ from Bleuler's notion of fundamental symptoms or from their modern operationalized successors that we find in DSM-4, the negative symptoms, and from the frank psychotic symptoms such as hallucination and delusion. According to Minkowski, these positive symptoms are a kind of defensive strategy that the patient instantiate in order to make sense of a world that has lost completely this sense because of the primitive autistic dimension of the psychosis. Nowadays, we are, especially my colleagues, when they study schizophrenia, they look at schizophrenia through the lenses of cognitive science. What they study is the correlation between a given genetic profile, which codes for the transporter of dopamine, serotonin, and executive function, working memory, and the like. But incredibly, these very basic pre-verbal dimensions of interpersonal experiences were never studied so far. We just began doing this. So we submitted this cohort of early-stage psychotic patients to the very same stimuli of the study I just showed you. So they were touched at the end of the study on their right and left hand to localize somatosensory-related regions in their brain. And before, they were watching the very same video clips that the control healthy patient had watched. And the interesting result is that the deactivation of the posterior insula while witnessing the affective quality of the tactile experiences of the others is missing. So their own posterior insula do not deactivate. And there is also a very strong decrease in the activation of the ventral premotor cortex, which is one of the member of that brain circuit that was down-regulating the activity in posterior insula in healthy control. So posterior insula does not deactivate when they witness the tactile sensation of others, probably or most likely also because the premotor cortex doesn't work properly. It is significantly less activated when they witness the tactile sensation of others. So the light bar are the schizophrenic patient, the dark gray bars are the activation in this area in controls. And there is a systematic correlation between poor activation in the premotor cortex and the severity of the basic symptoms as established by submitting this patient to the SPIA interview. So these results suggest that the border of the bodily self appear to be blurred in schizophrenic patients, as it is epitomized by a lack of self-other differentiation in the domain of affective tactile experiences, given the lack of deactivation of the posterior insula in patients during touch observation. Reduced activation in premotor multimodal integration regions and consistent correlation between bold response in this area and basic symptoms could reflect the neural basis of a reduced sense of a coherent bodily self in schizophrenia. And the last series of data I would like to share with you this morning deals with an effect we recently described in healthy controls, which deals with the implicit capacity to recognize our own bodily self when we are not explicitly asked of doing so. There is evidence that there seems to be a lateralization in the brain when we are supposed to process body parts which may belong to ourselves or to someone else. It turns out that the right hemisphere seemed to be more relevant in recognizing bodily parts of the self with respect to recognition of the same body parts when they belong to someone else. And Francesca Frassinetti was able to show that right side brain damage patient, particularly patients that suffer a damage in the posterior parietal or the premotor cortex, do not show what she defined as the bodily self-advantage. How did she discover this implicit bodily self-advantage? By simply asking people to do a very simple matching to sample task. There is a target image. It can be a nose, it can be a hand, it can be a foot, and subjects are simply required to tell which of the two images above or below the target image is equal. So ownership is never mentioned in the task. They are never asked, oh, tell me which, if that nose belongs to you or someone else. But please tell me which of these two noses is the one it is shown right in the middle, or which hand is the same, or which foot is the same. And it turns out that healthy controls are much better in solving this task when they are shown their own nose, their own hand, their own foot, with respect to when they are shown the hand, the foot, or the nose of someone else. But is this occurring also when we explicitly ask to establish body ownership to participants, which is what we did recently? So we did a task in which 1 week before, with an excuse, we asked participants to come to our lab, and we took digital pictures of their hand, their feet, their mobile phone, or their shoes. A week later, they came to the lab, and they were submitted to 2 experiments. The first experiment was as the experiment that Francesca used to study brain damage patients. Tell me which of these 2 images is identical to the target image, which appear here. And we did this for hands, feet, mobile phone, and shoes. 50% of the stimuli belong to the participant, 50% belong to someone else, to strangers. But this time we also did a second experiment in which we showed 2 stimuli, 2 shoes, 2 hands, 2 mobile phone, 2 feet. This time we explicitly asked to participants, please tell me which of the 2 is your hand, your foot, your mobile phone, your shoes. And here are the results in healthy controls and in early stage schizophrenic patients. In the implicit task, controls show the self-advantage, so they are more accurate in identifying the target image when it belongs to them, but psychotic patients don't. So they don't show this self-advantage. However, when we make the explicit task, neither of the 2 groups show an advantage when they are shown their own hand or their own foot. So in other words, both controls and schizophrenic patients, when explicitly asked to recognize whether a given body part belongs to them or not, are much worse with respect to when they are not asked. Because when you are explicitly asked, tell me if this is your hand or not, what most likely is going on in our mind is to confront a bodily image we have of our hand, of our foot, with the image we see on the screen. While in the case of the implicit task, the idea is that when we see a hand or a foot, particularly when it's our hand or our foot, we automatically instantiate a motor simulation, what we would possibly do with our hand, and this motor simulation gives us a perceptual advantage in processing that visual stimulus. This advantage, this automatic motor simulation, is absent in schizophrenic patients. So schizophrenic patients do not show the self-advantage for their own body parts in the implicit task, but similarly to controls, they do not show the self-advantage when explicitly asked. So schizophrenic patients have problems in activating a motor representation of their own body parts when looking at them, and such deficit shows the relevance of implicit motor representation, at least this is our hypothesis, of the body for a coherent sense of bodily self. Okay. So, as you probably realized, I never tried to draw any explicit parallel between your clinical work and these findings. I don't think it's our job to suggest to therapists how to use the outcome of basic neuroscientific investigations. But just allow me to suggest why I believe it makes sense for me to be among you today. I think this model of a pre-verbal level of interpersonal relation can be relevant to psychoanalysis for 4 main reasons. Because it provides a unified account of pre-verbal aspects of interpersonal relations that likely play an important role in shaping the self. Second, because it can contribute to a new definition of psychopathological processes. Third, because it enables to analyze the interpersonal pre-verbal dynamics of the therapeutic analytical setting from a different perspective. And fourth, because it sheds new light on the intimate relationship between language and the embodied experience we make of the world, thus offering new clues on the narrative identity of self. This is a part I couldn't cover in my talk, but I just very briefly refer to that when I said that we discovered that the very same brain region that activates when I act or I see someone else acting turns out to be activated also when I read or listen to a narrative describing the very same actions. So this might be relevant for language as well. So this is taken from Freud on aphasia, and this is a much more recent paper by Friedman Pulvermüller, and I would like to draw the striking similarity with the incredibly modern notion of language, which was heavily influenced by Ewing-Jackson, which Freud put in this essay, and modern theories of embodied language in our brain. And I open with Freud, and I would like to conclude with Freud. Here's a quote from an appendix to the Unconscious, 1915. A word acquires its meaning by being linked to an object presentation, and the object presentation itself is a complex of associations made up of the great variety of visual, acoustic, tactile, kinesthetic, and other presentation. And I think that cognitive neuroscience, or at the very least, a certain kind of cognitive neuroscience is specifically investigating this multimodal preverbal dimension of our interpersonal relation, which also has a very important bearing on the most explicit linguistically mediated intersubjectivity, which is at the core of your clinical investigation. Thank you.